wish list to their doorstep. One of the reasons why we're eager to address these issues at today's hearing is because Americans are eager to address these issues. In 2022, the effect of supply chain challenges aren't some distant policy issue to folks at home. Americans are seeing it play out in the empty shelves at their local grocery stores that once held baby formula, in gifts delayed and delivered weeks after a birthday has passed, or in new cars and technology that they've saved up for years to buy, but they can't find one on the market. With Father's Day coming up this weekend, any fathers in the room, happy Father's Day a couple of days early. But I'm reminded about just a month or so ago, as Mother's Day was approaching, going shopping for a Mother's Day card. I went to our local Rite Aid pharmacy to pick one up for my wife of 36 years, Martha, mother of our two sons, at a store where we've shopped for years with a huge selection of anniversary cards, birthday cards, holiday cards, you name it. I walked up and found an entire Mother's Day card section empty. And I found an employee and asked what was going on. And she said, this year's Mother's Day cards never made it to the store. And I said, not even one? She said, not even one. That was when I knew we had a problem. This is just one example of supply challenges happening all over across our country. And Americans and this committee want to know how we can get back on track. So today, we're going to explore how we got to this point and what we can do to ensure that we're better prepared in the future. I've long believed that one of the jobs of policymakers is to create a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation so that we may enjoy economic growth. And one key to maintaining that nurturing environment is improving the dependability of our supply chains. And while we know that this tremendous supply chain backlogs that we're seeing today come largely from the economic shock of the pandemic, many systemic vulnerabilities existed long before COVID. Fundamental weaknesses in our global logistics systems are the results of decades-long focus on supply chain efficiencies, just-in-time manufacturing, and a reliance on foreign adversaries for a wide array of goods. The result, I've been joined by Senator Cornyn. John, thank you. Thank you for being a big part of this, and to you and your team for working with us and preparing for this day. So this guy's been busy. If you haven't noticed, he's been busy on some other fronts, and we're very grateful for his leadership there. In fact, we postponed this hearing for a couple of weeks because his need to return to Texas following a terrible tragedy there. But the result is a system so brittle and fragile that it cracked under the pressure of the worst pandemic we've endured in over 100 years. As Albert Einstein used to say, and along with other things, Albert Einstein used to say, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. That's not my favorite Einstein quote. My favorite Einstein quote is, in adversity lies opportunity. That's guided me my whole life. In adversity lies opportunity, and should guide us in this case as well. These challenges produce great adversity, but also real opportunity for us to rethink how we move goods across the globe and create a system that better serves the American people. And that starts with investing in our own critical infrastructure. And I'm proud to say that every member of this committee, especially the guy here on my left, is that we've already taken some historic steps through the passage of our bipartisan infrastructure law to, among other things, improve the efficiency of our ports and make our roads and bridges safer while expediting the movement of goods and people across America. However, it's clear that infrastructure investment is only one piece of the puzzle. Another piece is expanding domestic investments in the technologies we rely upon, from semiconductors to renewable energy products, so that we don't find ourselves over-relying on a foreign adversary or jeopardizing our national security for the sake of supply chain. Through these investments, we can create jobs and support American manufacturing. That's a real win-win where I come from. A good place to start is China competition legislation currently being reconciled between the two chambers of Congress. And I again commend our friend and ranking member Senator Cornyn for his leadership in supporting CHIPS funding, among other things, through that process. And while domestic investment is a key part of shoring up our supply chains for years to come, we've also come to focus on a fundamental principle central to the supply chain discussion, and that is working together with our global partners. And as leaders of this subcommittee, Senator Cornyn and I have repeatedly called for greater U.S. economic engagement and leadership across the globe, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. By reaching out to our allies across the globe and bringing more nations into a shared economic framework, we can improve the security and the resiliency of our supply chains, leading to a wider range of products and lower costs for American consumers. That's part of the reason why I was happy to see Senator Biden announce the start of an Indo-Pacific economic framework to bring more good faith trading partners into a stronger, fair global economy and create even more diverse, resilient supply chains. Ultimately, building secure and flexible supply chains will require both economic cooperation with our allies across the globe and more strategic investment in critical industries and workers here at home. So, today, we look forward to hearing from our witnesses with respect to their insight on solutions to these challenges so that the next generation of American families won't have to worry about the empty shelves. They won't have to worry so much about higher prices because we'll be ready for what's to come. So once more, my thanks to our ranking member, our respective staffs, and especially to our witnesses that are appearing before us today. And with that, I want to turn it over to Senator Cornyn for any comments that he'd like to make. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing, and it's a pleasure to work with you and your staff in organizing it. It's a timely and important topic. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here virtually and otherwise. This subcommittee continues its work in exploring the geopolitical benefits and consequences of America's trade policy with the world, and in particular our foreign adversaries like China and Russia. The topic of resiliency and critical supply chains is an important one, and as the COVID-19 pandemic revealed, it awakened many of us to our dependence on foreign adversaries for critical goods, or from friends, but in a way that our foreign adversaries could disrupt. We need to reinforce the rules-based international trading system for those nations who at least attempt to abide by free trade agreements, like the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think I mentioned to you, Mr. Chairman, in my trip to Japan recently with Senator Cardin and Senator Hagerty, every single government official we met with talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we told them, that, at least for ourselves, that I regretted that we did not engage when we had a chance on that. But sometimes you learn lessons the hard way. The administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a positive step in the right direction, but we can't play games with our nation's survival by outsourcing the crown jewels of our economy to nations like China, which have used our free market system against us while not playing by the rules themselves. Nearly 20 years ago, our government opened the door to do business in China, and industry did what it does best. Found a market, captured it, and achieved efficiency and innovation. What we've learned since is that the Chinese Communist Party, not its people, perverted that goodwill through theft and control to achieve a strategic advantage. Our own people and hometown industries suffered as a result. Now we need to come together, labor, business, and government as one nation, and put aside past disagreements to find the right balance in preserving our critical supply chains while maintaining strong trade relations. This includes providing incentives in some cases, like the Chips for America Act I authored with Senator Warner, and Senator Wyden is part of as well, to bring our semiconductor production back home to America. It means reducing the regulatory burdens on American businesses that want to thrive in our domestic and foreign markets and abide by our rules-based international trading system. And it means having an honest look and conversation about the challenges we face. For example, a few weeks ago, the Senate Intelligence Committee had a hearing where a former Trump administration official highlighted that U.S. financial investments in China-domiciled companies totaled $2.3 trillion in market value. It's pretty clear that U.S. companies have fueled China's economic rise. Former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster recently said last year venture capital firms invested $114 billion and Chinese companies that are developing dual use and sensitive technology that are going to be weaponized against us or are already aiding and abetting Russians. I believe it's time to have a conversation, an honest conversation, about the role that American investment has played in building the Chinese economy, especially in the areas of critical supply chains and our over-reliance on those supply chains in areas such as semiconductors. The first step that Senator Casey and I have proposed is by granting the U.S. government the authority to have visibility into those investments in the supply chains of our foreign adversaries through the establishment of an interagency committee led by the President that provides for a whole-of-government approach in responding to Chinese economic coercion. That means, at minimum, a mandatory notification and circulation of investments by recipients of taxpayer funds designed to compete with China, such as those envisioned in the Bipartisan Innovation Act and the CHIPS for America Act, which will serve as the basic guardrails for protecting those investments. This week, Senator Casey and I, along with many of our colleagues, have introduced a revised version of our National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, demonstrating our good faith in trying to come up with a solution that actually works and that can gain the necessary support. This bill incorporates input from industry and represents a positive step in the push to safeguard our critical capabilities. I look forward to hearing from more stakeholders in the coming days, and I'm eager to discuss that topic with today's witnesses as well. We have before us Mr. Louis, who comes from the intelligence community to provide us a national security perspective. Mr. Potvin, who I believe your intimate knowledge of the supply chain and logistic backlogs will be of great importance. Ms. Frankel, your experience in government will help us understand the rules-based international trading system and what our agreements will mean and what they don't mean going forward. Mr. Paul, you bring in valuable insight from a coalition of both the labor and manufacturing industry. So I look forward to hearing your testimony and answers to questions that follow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. We're joined by Senator Bob Casey to my right, Senator Casey from Pennsylvania. I had the pleasure of serving as governor with his father, and I have the pleasure of serving in the U.S. Senate with his son. How lucky can one guy be? Me. That's great. Great to see you, Bob. Our first witness today is Mr. Scott Paul, who is the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. The Alliance for American Manufacturing, I understand it's a partnership, isn't it? It's a partnership between the U.S. Steelworkers Union and some of America's leading manufacturers. I just find that very refreshing. It's kind of like sort of the partnership that the three of us have on a lot of issues as well. As president, Mr. Paul works to support domestic manufacturing initiatives so that American workers and businesses can thrive. Mr. Paul is the past chair of the National Skills Coalition and sits on the board of the visitors of the Political Science Department at Pennsylvania State University, the home of the Nittany Lions. This is a Buckeye welcomes the Nittany Lion to this hearing. Well, Mr. Paul, you have the floor. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, and Senator Casey. We'll punt on the football opportunities here and get to the testimony. On behalf of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, which you indicated was a partnership of the steelworkers and domestic manufacturers, thanks for this opportunity to testify today on an issue of vital importance to our economic and national security. Now, the last several years have made all Americans painfully aware of the tragic inadequacy of our deteriorated industrial capabilities and broken supply chains. The pandemic and its economic shockwaves also exposed a dangerous reliance on global suppliers for many consumer and commercial products, revealing that the United States is ill-equipped to produce enough semiconductors and other products for everyday life, let alone the quantities needed to address a future emergency. The frailty of on-demand global supply chains and our utter reliance on them has left us dangerously exposed for the past 2 years and unprepared for future shocks. These disruptions should be viewed through the lens of years of public policy decisions that both facilitated and, in some cases, actively encouraged the offshoring of domestic production and critical supply chains. 90,000 American manufacturing facilities have closed their doors since the 1990s. China surpassed the United States as the world's largest manufacturing nation in 2010, Imports have outstripped GDP and domestic production growth over the past 2 decades. This replacement has led to the loss of 5 million good middle-class jobs in devastated communities across our nation, and it has left us increasingly dependent on imports, often from adversarial countries like China and Russia, for everything from consumer goods and advanced technology products to life-saving personal protective equipment. In America, we consume 20% of the world's goods, but we make far less than that. 10% of the world's electric vehicles, 7% of lithium-ion batteries, 12% of semiconductors, and 4% of printed circuit boards, for example. There is only one major domestic manufacturer of electrical steel needed to build out our energy grid, and there are many other examples of greatly diminished capacity in critical industries. To address current supply chain disruptions, as well as anticipate and prepare for future crises, we must acknowledge how we got here and what went wrong. The pandemic has exposed in rather dramatic fashion that years of flawed tax, trade, procurement, and other economic policies have put the United States in a perilous position of overdependence on imports. We recognize that the United States has important security and trade relationships with our allies, and we can and should utilize those where it makes sense. But our vulnerabilities reflect an outdated notion of the benefits of hyper-globalization, where our consumers, workers, domestic businesses, and national security suffer. We must break the vicious cycle of implementing policies that reward imports over domestic production. I cite 2 reports by former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge and retired Brigadier General John Adams in my written testimony, and I would encourage the subcommittee to study these. The concerns they highlighted about our supply chains a decade ago have only grown. For instance, cancer patients facing scarcity of contrasting materials for essential medical imaging revealed last month, or the Chinese Communist Party threatening to weaponize rare earths, and these examples go on and on. Rebuilding supply chains will chart a course for a stronger future and create millions of new, well-paid jobs along the way. We must acknowledge that supply chain resiliency is not a challenge that the private sector alone can fix. There is an appropriate role for government to provide leadership, coordination, a supportive policy framework, and funding directed to domestic production expansion where the vulnerabilities are most critical. That's why we support swift and successful conclusion of conference committee work on the competitiveness legislation that Senator Carper mentioned. Merging the most attractive provisions from each of the House and Senate bills offers the opportunity to create a long overdue policy framework for supply chain security, resiliency, and revitalization. AAM has outlined our conference priorities in a letter to House and Senate leaders, including the CHIPS Act, expanding manufacturing research, development, and deployment efforts, a supply chain resiliency fund, strengthened trade enforcement tools, including the Level the Playing Field Act 2.0, as well as screening outbound investments in critical sectors, as Senator Cornyn mentioned. We've offered additional detailed policy recommendations in my written submission. And I would just close with this thought. I think we can have a brighter future for supply chains and manufacturing. We see examples of where public policies have invited new investments over the past several years, and I cite many of these examples in my written testimony. Just a generation ago, some economists predicted none of this, large new factories or surges in manufacturing jobs, would ever be possible again due to automation and import competition. But we should not pretend that a brief focus on supply chains alone will build on this momentum. It must be a sustained effort. Public policy support for American manufacturing is crucial to tackling supply chain challenges, and we look forward to working with you to ensure a better future. Thanks for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing.
No, we thank you, Mr. Paul. Well done. Thank you so much. Our next witness is Doug Potvin. Doug is the Chief Financial Officer of a company called Trinity Logistics. Trinity Logistics is a third-party logistics provider that is headquartered in Seaford, Delaware, and that company that operates nationwide. People say, where is Seaford, Delaware? What is it famous for? Seaford, Delaware was the home of the world's first nylon plant. It's established by the DuPont company, where not that many years ago, 4,000 people worked. In fact, 4,000 people worked there forever. I think I shook every one of those hands many times. And we are grateful for what DuPont has done for our state and nation, really, and especially in the Seaford area. For the past 40 years, Trinity Logistics has offered freight management, they've offered transportation, they've offered innovative supply chain solutions. And as CFO, Mr. Potvin is responsible for overseeing financial reporting and payment management, as well as a carrier and risk management. He also oversaw the implementation of Trinity's information technology infrastructure. And before I say, Mr. Potvin, you have the floor, I understand you're joined today by a couple of extraordinary women whose first name is Sarah, one of whom happens to be your wife, and the other whom happens to be the president of the company. And I'm just going to be watching carefully to see if their lips move when you speak. So we'll see how that works out. But we welcome both Sarahs, and we especially welcome you as their front man, and anxious to hear what you have to say. Well, welcome, and great to see you, Doug. Thanks. Please proceed.
When I introduce myself, I'm saying the CFO, Chief Fun Officer of Trinity Logistics, because we like to have fun when we're working hard. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, Senator Casey, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today regarding how policymakers and business leaders are addressing the existing backlogs in the supply chain in the short term and building more resilient supply chains in the long term. My name is Doug Potvin. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Trinity Logistics, a third-party logistics company headquartered in Seaford. I'm privileged, honored, and humbled here today representing Trinity Logistics, our association, the Transportation Intermediary Association, and the entire third-party logistics industry that we serve. We serve as an intermediary solving the logistical needs of our shipper customers by sourcing capacity from motor carriers and vendor partners. We're proud to report today that this past year we've generated over $1 billion in revenue, have arranged over 500,000 shipments, and offer 350 individual full and part-time jobs. We truly are a proud Delaware company. From Charles Dickens' The Novel of Tales of Two Cities, it was the best of time, it was the worst of times. A season of light is a season of darkness. A spring of hope is a winter of despair. Over the last 2 years, the same can be said of the international supply chain and, from our perspective, closer to home, the domestic transportation industry. In March of 2020, as both domestic and international countries shuttered businesses, including the shuttering of the port cities and operations in China, and the fact that most consumers were at home facing an uncertain future, freight volumes plummeted. Motor carrier capacity increased dramatically due to the steep drop of goods moving, and the transportation market saw prices to motor carriers fall. In fact, Trinity Logistics was mentioned on a Facebook post that we were earning an average gross margin of 60%, which was simply wrong. In addition, a small number of motor carriers came to Washington, D.C. and demanded rate transparency. Interesting, after the businesses, ports, and countries opened up, freight volumes began to skyrocket, available motor capacity tightened up, rates paid to motor carriers increased to reflect a change in the market conditions. Demand for rate transparency went silent. The pricing in our industry is driven by market conditions, supply and demand, large scale. No entity on either side of the equation has enough market share to drive rates. In addition, each shipment has its own variable considerations to take into account, including everything from available capacity in various regional markets, lead time for products, dwell time at shippers and consignees, commodities needing moved, and the type of equipment needed. All this happens real time to ensure goods get to market, keeping our economy moving forward. Now more than ever, the role of a third-party logistics professional has become more valuable. Companies like Trinity and the other 28,000 licensed property brokers are working overtime to ensure the essential goods continue to be delivered in an efficient manner to meet our customers' and consumer needs. Our industry, along with motor carriers, are a main component of the why during the crisis and disruption, the supply chain bent but never broke. Trinity Logistics applauds the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives' bipartisan passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act and the historic investment in the transportation and infrastructure. We're very pleased to see how quickly the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration established the Safe Driver's Apprentice pilot program. Trinity hopes this 3-year pilot program will be successful and made permanent so that individuals ages 18 to 20 will explore interstate transport careers. Trinity also believes that the spending under the Investment Act ramps up in the near future, it will provide enough support in the economy to keep the motor carriers employed, as we are starting to see freight volumes begin to pull back over the last 30 to 60 days. Trinity would also like to thank Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, Senator Menendez, Senator Tim Scott for the support in offering legislation and getting the Senate to act unanimously in passing the Custom Trade Partnership Against Terrorist Program Act. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Currently, the vaccine mandate for truck drivers coming into the country to deliver freight from Mexico and Canada continues. These professional drivers spend most of their professional times alone in the truck cab, presenting 0% risk of spreading COVID-19. This should be lifted immediately to open up capacity and shorten the amount of time it takes for goods to move cross-border. Another issue that greatly impacts not only the efficient movement of goods but also highway safety is the lack of a federal motor carrier safety selection standard. Currently, because of broken safety rating systems from the federal FMCSA, almost 90% of trucking companies are considered unrated. There are no requirements in place before selecting a trucking company drastically impacts the overall safety on our nation highways. The latest report from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration noted that the number of accidents involving commercial motor vehicles increased 13% in 2021. The status quo is not working and highway safety needs to be improved. Trinity Logistics and our trade association, TIA, fully supports legislation to create a motor carrier safety selection and amend the safety rating process. The U.S. trucking spot market conditions have inflected towards weaker and more normal conditions, though we still will see what the future holds and how that trend continues. Hopefully, as a result of this meeting and coordinated action taken by the United States, our trading partners, manufacturers, supply chain vendors, our nations will become resilient when facing similar conditions and uncertainty. And again, thank you for your time today and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thanks for that testimony and for joining us today, Doug. Our third witness is Dr. Orit Frankel. Orit, I've never met an Orit before. Where does that name come from?
It's actually Israeli.
Israeli? Okay. Well, good. Welcome. The co-founder of the American Leadership Initiative, an organization founded to advocate for American leadership in both trade and foreign policy. Orit began her career with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Who was a trade rep when you started working there?
Clayton Yeiter.
Okay, yeah. Where she was a director for trade in high technology products and deputy director for trade with Japan. Prior to co-founding ALI, she served as the senior manager for General Electric's global affairs, responsible for advising GE on trade and investment policy in Asia. Dr. Frankel, we're delighted you're here. Please proceed. You have the floor.
Thank you so much to the committee. American Leadership Initiative really appreciates the opportunity to testify. Our mission is to put our country and citizens on the right trajectory for the 21st century through new approaches to trade and foreign policy, by strengthening global alliances and institutions, doubling down on values and emphasizing inclusive and sustainable growth at home and abroad. Current supply shortages have raised awareness of the need to diversify supply chains and reduce U.S. dependency on adversarial and unreliable regimes. They've spurred a bipartisan momentum to shore up American competitiveness and manufacturing, which we see in the Bipartisan Innovation Act, and we urge the conference to reach agreement and pass this important legislation. We should look for ways to streamline supply chains, including encouraging full implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, signed in 2017, and assisting countries to digitize customs documentation. Finally, we should explore eliminating some of our own China 301 tariffs, especially on consumer goods where they do not compete with American suppliers. The supply chain crisis offers the U.S. a unique opportunity to find the right balance between onshoring and right-shoring and creating sourcing patterns which support our economic and foreign policy goals. Friendshoring is important, especially when moving key technologies out of China. The effort to coordinate semiconductor supply chains under the U.S.-EU Tech and Trade Council, as well as with Japan and Korea, show how allies can work together to ensure that sourcing of key technologies stays in countries that are reliable and share our values. Concerns about timely access to certain goods is an argument for nearshoring. Last week, the U.S. launched an initiative to encourage private sector investment in the Northern Triangle countries to encourage economic development and reduce the incentive for migration. To expand sourcing in that region, the U.S. must invest in capacity building to upgrade infrastructure, expand trade facilitation. This initiative can be a model for U.S. sourcing in Africa and the rest of Latin America, to counter China's heavy investment in those regions. U.S. supply chain policy should be used to advance U.S. standards. The newly launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, is a pillar focused on supply chain resiliency and seeks to advance labor, environmental, and digital standards in Asia, giving those countries an alternative to China's regressive standards. To expand those sourcing partnerships, the U.S. will need to, again, invest in capacity building to train workers, raise standards, and partner with the U.S. private sector. We have suggested offering IPEF countries who meet key standards a preferred supplier status, allowing their goods to be expedited through U.S. customs. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, going into effect next week, I believe, seeks to ensure that imports into the U.S. from Xinjiang are not produced with forced labor. This restriction is leading U.S. companies to find new sourcing destinations and is an example of how the U.S. can advance labor rights and human rights in the supply chain. Supply chains can also encourage green sourcing. And in a recent path-breaking agreement on steel and aluminum, the U.S. and EU agreed to address carbon intensity and overcapacity of high-carbon steel and aluminum. This arrangement can also be a model to achieve low-carbon production in other source sectors. China's digital Silk Road has brought authoritarian digital standards of surveillance, monitoring, and censorship. The U.S. must be a standard setter in the digital space by negotiating agreements and offering countries its model of transparency, openness, and democracy. The U.S. should continue to strengthen relationships with allies and expand its network of plurilateral arrangements to create new opportunities for friendshoring, nearshoring, and supplier resiliency. Rethinking supply chains offers the opportunity to build new sourcing paradigms that protect key technologies, pursue American standards, benefit American consumers and workers, and advance U.S. values. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frankel. Thanks for your presence today. Thanks very much for your testimony. Finally, Gilman Louie, and Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of America's Frontier Fund, I believe, public-private partnership created to ensure that America leads the next wave of technology innovation. Mr. Louie previously co-founded and served as CEO of NQTEL, a venture capital fund created to invest in new technologies critical to national security. Mr. Louie currently serves as a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, among many other distinctions. Mr. Louie, great to meet you today, and you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, and members of the committee for inviting me here today. It is an honor to serve as a witness and to share my perspectives on supply chain resiliency, national security, and emerging technologies. I'm the CEO of America's Frontier Fund, a new nonprofit public-private investment fund focused on deep technologies and platforms critical to the security and prosperity of the United States and its allies. I'm here in my personal capacities, not on behalf of the U.S. government or any of my other affiliations. After serving on the National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence, I'm convinced that the United States faces a new, full-spectrum, great power competition against nation-states committed to out-investing and out-innovating the United States. Our supply chains are vulnerable. We are losing our lead in technologies, and our future is at risk. We need all of America engaged in this competition. We need the technologists, the philanthropists, the investors, the hardworking Americans from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, and the entire heartland in between. Everyone. This is the U.S. government's moment to do what Americans do best. That's to lead. The time to act is now. But first, we should ask how we got here in the first place. The challenges we face today arose from decades of just-in-time, lean manufacturing approaches to incrementally improve profits while moving our key manufacturing capabilities and risks offshore. We now have a very efficient, highly efficient but increasingly brittle global supply chain. These well-intentioned decisions by individual corporations creates challenges to our economic security through three market failures. First, underinvestment in foundational technologies has stifled innovation and deterred talent in key areas. Second, countries in East Asia have created artificially attractive offshoring investment environments. And third, the U.S. has high barriers to entry for domestic advanced manufacturing. Take microelectronics as an example. There are only 2 leading-edge microelectronics firms globally and no leading-edge fabrication facilities domestically, while overseas fabs are at real risk. Samsung's fab in South Korea are within North Korea's artillery and missile range. And TSMC producing the vast majority of cutting-edge chips. 90% of the cutting-edge chips are produced at TSMC, and it's only 110 miles off of China's missile batteries. Today, the U.S. risks losing access to critical technology components that we have used every day. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine highlights the perils of a fragile supply chain. And we do not want to become Russia if we find ourselves in a future conflict. Over the long term, we face an even greater risk of being surpassed technologically by China. Imagine you're driving along at the Texas Hill Country and your GPS suddenly stops working. It's a minor inconvenience. Unfriendly foreign nations, on the other hand, could shut down our weapon systems, prevent our planes from flying, cut off our communications, inspect our information and our data. We invite trouble by falling behind our adversaries. This situation is unacceptable. Fortunately, there are still reasons for optimism. Threats create opportunities for revitalization, and now I will propose a framework with 4 pillars to move forward. First, we must reimagine U.S. manufacturing capabilities. Public funding should be a signal to unlock necessary private capital. That $45 trillion of American capital sitting could be invested here in the United States. We need to also expand our talent pools at all levels of education, not just STEM. We need the scientists and engineers, but we need the trades, the skilled labor, the technicians, the plumbers, the electricians to rebuild our manufacturing capabilities here in the United States. Second, we must invest in promising technology hubs across America. 5 coastal cities have generated 90% of the innovation jobs in the United States over the past decade. But the next wave of innovation must include more technology hubs beyond those coasts. There are 35 great technology centers between the coasts. We need to invest in those centers. Samsung's new facility in Texas is a step in the right direction, but there's more to do to unlock the potential of the American heartland. Third, we must disclose the risks of investing in authoritarian nations. It is important that companies and funds report to their stakeholders, investors, and partnerships that they have with adversarial nations. I believe we should add D for democracy to Wall Street's environmental, social, and governance criteria to help identify the material business risks created by investing in autocratic nations. Whether a nation commits to democracy and a rules-based international trading order should shape American investments for the future. Finally, we need to deepen our technology engagements with allies and partners. This means prioritizing friendshoring and creating new pathways through the Quad and other coalitions for investing jointly in emerging technologies. Just as we have TSA pre-check for trusted flyers, we need similar systems for fast-tracking allies and investors to do business here in the United States. In conclusion, we need to solve key market failures by reimagining the U.S. manufacturing, investing in deep technologies, investing in promising technology hubs across the United States, and redirecting capital to democracies and deepening allied engagement. As this committee considers options for supply chain resilience and long-term technology leadership, you have an important role to play. With your leadership, this can be America's moment. Let's get everyone in this room and across our great country involved to seize this initiative. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lloyd. Great to meet you, and we appreciate very much your presence and your testimony. One of the things that Senator Corner and I, and Senator Casey, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Young, and Senator Whitehouse, who was here and will probably be coming back, one of the things we focus on is finding consensus on difficult issues. And we're pretty good at it. Our Committee on Environment and Public Works that Senator Whitehouse serves on with me reported unanimously out of our committee infrastructure legislation on water, wastewater, so forth, infrastructure legislation on roads, highways, bridges, on climate change, unanimously. And they're doing the same thing on Water Resource Development Act. I don't know at the end of the day if we'll find consensus on some of the issues, all the issues that we're talking about here today, but I would like to start off just asking each of you the same question. And as we have a panel that's good, that's smart, and that's well versed on these issues, where do you think are a couple of areas where there's just real strong consensus and agreement that you would, in the Navy we used to, when we were like getting training, getting our training for whatever we're doing in naval aviation, we were having in a classroom and instructors going through stuff that we needed to know to be good in our airplanes. He would like stomp his foot on the issues that we were going to be tested on and had to know how to really know how to conquer and take care of. But anyway, one or two issues you think there's real consensus here from our witnesses that you would say, we agree on this, and you ought to take that to heart. You want to lead us off, Mr. Paul?
Absolutely, Senator Carper, and thank you for the question. I think there are a number of things, but let me highlight two or three. I think one that you've mentioned specifically, and I'll expand it more broadly, is investments in the competitiveness of our economy. Infrastructure, I think, was a first step. I think some of the provisions in the Bipartisan Innovation Act that look at supporting research and development efforts and other supply chain resiliency efforts for manufacturing, research development, and not only that, but deployment, which has been the missing part here. If you're just investing in R&D, but you're not investing in producing that in America, that is leaking tax dollars. I think that's also important. And I think that we can find consensus on reducing dependence on adversaries for key goods that have commercial, military, and other applications that are essential to our future. I'll just give a quick example here, lithium-ion batteries. There's an issue where China has dominated the market, the government and state-related firms. We're behind. It will take a public investment to catch up to that. It is an energy storage feature of the future and something that's going to be in demand. And I think if we focus on some efforts like that, we can make progress as we move ahead.
Good. Those are good ones. That's good. Thanks. Mr. Potvin, same question. Consensus. Where do you see it?
What I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is simply we can't be relying on just a couple sources for values of goods and services. The simple fact of the matter, based on a free market society, and therefore we need to be able to source goods and raw materials from other places, not be relying on whether a port shuts down in a foreign country, or the simple fact that we're relying on this company or that company to provide. One thing we like in the third-party logistics industry is the simple fact that no one player controls more than 4% of the entire market that we play in. And people have choices. They can go places if something should happen. They can go to someone else and look for it. So we agree that there is consensus that the nearshoring, bringing back domestic manufacturing back to the U.S. is very strong. It needs to happen. So again, we're not relying on single sourcing or even double sourcing or a monopoly out there. So we do believe that the free market needs to grow and prosper in that nature. We also believe in the support of small industries to drive those type of businesses as well. So it's just not, again, large companies, but again, that we're sourcing all our items from different sectors of the economy, from different sizes of the economy as well. The owner-operators, the people in one truck, were very strong and very powerful when COVID first came. They're the ones primarily going to go pick up the goods during the time of COVID. As larger companies, HR departments said, hey, wait a second, let's see where this is all going. So resiliency associated with across the spectrum of economic providers is also should be consensus. We don't care where it comes as long as it comes from a great place. We're working hard to support the consumers. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Dr. Frankel?
Yes, I'm going to agree with Mr. Paul on a number of things. I think, we need to really increase our investment in R&D. I think China is really outpacing us in that investment area, which is scary. We need to invest in key technologies like semiconductors, as we see in the CHIPS Act. We need to think strategically about what we want to friendshore, nearshore, and onshore. We need to think about what key technologies we want to decouple from China. We need to work with our allies, and because we need to make sure that key technologies, in addition to being onshored, are manufactured in countries that are reliable and safe and share our values. Lastly, we need to give other countries, like in Latin America or Asia, an alternative to China and reach agreements with them that can allow them to be preferred suppliers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, ma'am.
I think we can all agree on what the list should be of the deep technologies the U.S. cannot afford to lose leadership position in. We have to continue to lead in microelectronics. We have to lead in AI and quantum sciences and advanced manufacturing. We can't afford to have 5G happen again to us on the next 6G innovations of important communications capability. And we need to lead in the biosciences. But I would also say we can also agree that a dollar invested in the U.S. is not the same as a dollar invested overseas in adversarial nations. Those other dollars have significant risks attached to them. And not only at national security risks, but economic risks. Disclosure should be foundational for where we need to go forward, not just in public companies, but any public funds where public funds are being used to fund technologies in adversarial nations. And finally, I think we all can agree that we need to actually extend the promise of the innovation economy to all of America. It cannot just be on the edges of our coast. It really does need to involve every American at every level of education to move forward not only our ability economically, but to maintain our national security.
That's great. Thank you. There's a lot of consensus here, and that was very helpful to put it all together. Thank you. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Louie, I wanted to ask you about the proper balance between outbound investment for the United States and in terms of its investments in places like China. You heard me say that in the Intelligence Committee a few weeks ago, we had an expert witness who pointed out that the market value of U.S. companies' investments in China is roughly $2.3 trillion. But as we know, China doesn't play by the rules, and when it comes to protecting our crown jewels, that's the balance we're trying to achieve, not to prevent investment in China or any other place, but we don't want to give them something we can't afford to lose. What's the right balance in your view?
Well, I think your points are well taken. U.S. companies invest 100 times more in Chinese companies than China invests in American companies, to give you a sense of what that ratio is. I think the right balance here is we've seen what took place in the days after the Ukrainian invasion, right? American companies, for the most part, acted responsibly. They pulled out. They understood the dangers, not just to brand, but to democracies of having continued activity over in Russia. I think if you give American companies the opportunity to make the right decision, look, this is not about the U.S. choosing to decouple from China. China has a date. They have a policy called Made in China 2025. They set the date. They're going to decouple, right? And our investment over there will be at risk. Now, we're not saying that it isn't appropriate in certain industries for American capital to flow to China to build great products for the rest of the world. Those companies have to make those decisions for themselves. But in areas of national security, where the technologies are critical on determining whether or not our systems are going to prevail against a competitor and adversarial systems, we need to have sharp tools. We need to be decisive. And industry needs to be able to get the signal quickly from government with precision. We can't use tools that are blunt. We can't have our U.S. industries held back, but at the same time, U.S. industries have to be responsible, not only to their stakeholders, but to democracies and the American public.
Again, from Mr. Louie, we hear nearly every day about the need for ESG, environmental, social, and governance analysis. Wall Street uses that to, and so do various companies. But you make an intriguing suggestion that we need to add a D to that for democracy. How would that actually work? I mean, does the U.S. government have a role in that, or are we looking for good corporate citizens to include that, or are we looking for Wall Street to try to do that for us? It just strikes me as a fascinating idea, but I don't know how you would implement it.
I think a combination of things. So the first one is disclosure, right? If you're investing capital overseas in places that are at risk, where a country can simply make a decision to have a crackdown and investors could lose 60% of their market cap values overnight, American investors, by the way, American pension funds, American endowments, that's at real risk. So how do you implement an ESG plus D? First one is disclosure. Number two, to educate investors of the risk. Investors will make good decisions. That's the whole principle of ESG. It isn't about Chinese-style authoritarianism of telling companies what to do, but trusting our companies to do the right thing as long as stakeholders have visibility and information they need to have good decisions to be made. And finally, having corporate America and Wall Street set standards. I'm a big believer in standard setting, and I think industry has something to say about that. The D part, how much of your capital is at risk? How much manufacturing is dependent upon another nation that can make your supply chain brittle? Every investor needs to understand what that risk factor is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Let me just run through the lineup here. Senator Menendez was here earlier, so he would be next in line. Senator Grassley was here early. He may be coming back. Senator Casey would be next after Senator Menendez, followed by Senator Cortez Masto, Senator Whitehouse, and Senator Young. So, Bob, please. Senator Menendez, New Jersey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hosting this important hearing. Dr. Frankel, thank you for hosting me at the American Leadership Initiative to introduce my Economic Statecraft for the 21st Century Act. It's a new whole-of-government approach to confront and compete with China's predatory international economic policy. Included in my legislation are provisions to prohibit the export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, to direct the State Department to coordinate with like-minded partners in securing global supply chains vis-a-vis China. Last month, the President announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, known as IPEF, which, with one of its 4 pillars, similarly focusing on supply chain resiliency and coordination. So I see my Economic Statecraft bill and the President's IPEF as two sides of the same coin, dual efforts to revitalize United States leadership and in the global economy. So what else do you believe needs to be done to secure our supply chains around the world?
Thank you, Senator, and it was our pleasure to host you. So I think IPEF is an excellent first start in terms of U.S. leadership in Asia, setting American standards and focusing on supply chain resiliency in that region. As I mentioned earlier, last week the administration launched a somewhat an initiative with Latin America to look at standards, et cetera, and I think it would be great if that would be upgraded to be more like IPEF, and we had a stronger initiative with those countries in our backyard. As you probably know, China is investing very heavily in Latin America at this point, buying ports and mines and key strategic infrastructure. So I think U.S. engagement and trade agreements with Latin America would be really important. I think the U.S.-EU Trade and Tech Council is an excellent initiative, and I think strengthening and doubling down on key technologies that we want to friendshore and make sure stay in countries where we have strong alliances and share values is very important. And that picks up on your point of looking at what technologies we want to onshore. Some of those also need to be friendshored. So I think that's important. So to my mind, I think the U.S. engaging in more plurilateral initiatives like IPEF is going to be very important. I also mentioned full implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is a WTO agreement that was signed in 2017. Its implementation was paused for a couple of years because of the pandemic, and I think fully implementing that would be very helpful. It is an initiative to help primarily developing countries digitize their customs processes, learn how to provide capacity building to them to really upgrade their supply chain initiatives and customs processes.
Thank you. Let me ask one other question further on IPEF. I applauded the President's leadership on economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. I was out there about a month ago, and I heard time and time again that your presence is important, but your engagement economically is critically important. It's a good first step towards working with like-minded allies and partners to set global standards, improve competitiveness, and strengthen supply chains. However, I, along with 51 other senators, sent a letter to President Biden urging him to include Taiwan in IPEF. Taiwan's a key trading partner of the United States, one with whom we have a strategic relationship that is intimately intertwined with our economic security, particularly as it relates to trade in semiconductors. Now, Taiwan wasn't included in the initial IPEF rollout, but I'm hopeful that the recently announced U.S.-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade can result in a bilateral IPEF-like agreement. How beneficial would it be for our supply chain security if Taiwan were extended the same benefits and uphold the same standards as other IPEF countries?
I think it would be enormously successful. I mean, I understand, Taiwan, as you pointed out, is a very important trade partner, particularly in semiconductors, and I think we really should have quite a robust agreement with them. I understand the political sensitivity around maybe not including them in IPEF at this point, and I know that the administration has to do a delicate dance between supporting Taiwan and wanting a robust economic relationship with them and, maybe not alienating, not risking strong military encounter with China. But I definitely support strong engagement with Taiwan, applaud the agreement that was negotiated, and hopefully maybe one day that would progress into full inclusion into IPEF.
Thank you. I agree. I see Mr. Louis was shaking his head yes, I think. So we'll add that as also a concurrence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You thank you. Senator Menendez is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, so he knows of what he speaks. Senator Casey, he also knows what he speaks. Senator Casey, our neighbor in Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for calling this hearing. We appreciate your leadership on these issues, and great to be working with you and Senator Cornyn in particular on the legislation on outbound investment review, and appreciate the testimony and the presence of all of our witnesses. Mr. Paul, I had a question for you, and I was noting the sobering data in your statement. 90,000 American manufacturing facilities closing since the late 1990s. As of 2019, China having 29% of global factory output, the U.S. only 17%. the loss of 5 million good-paying middle-class jobs, on and on and on. The data is just almost incomprehensible. And we've got to ask ourselves some difficult questions, especially after the pandemic. I mean, all these questions were relevant before the pandemic, ever more so in the aftermath, or what we hope will soon be the aftermath. The U.S. has ceded manufacturing capacity to other countries, especially China, and a number of these countries don't play by any rules, whether it was PPE shortages, I should say, or whether it's car and smartphone shortages we're facing today. It's affecting every facet of our economy, and that's resulting in higher prices, among other causes. One of my biggest concerns is we don't even know how much, the quantum of American capital or innovation and know-how that's being transferred overseas. That's why we have our critical capabilities legislation with Senator Cornyn and I spoke of. We've got to find out how much we're relying upon these foreign adversaries, both with regard to the design and manufacture of goods that are critical to both economic and national security. And the good news is we have consensus. We've got both Democrats and Republicans here in the House and the Senate that are ready to come together on a proposal. So I ask you this question about outbound investment. How does that outbound capital flow and also the transfer of the know-how and intellectual property to places like China undermine our supply chain resiliency?
Senator Casey, thank you for the question. I want to commend the leadership that you, Senator Cornyn, and others have provided on this issue. I think it's important, and we hope it gets across the finish line. I would say the impact of that investment has an outsized effect on our abilities in the United States to produce and to innovate. And it's important for this reason. First of all, shareholder interests and national security interests are rarely ever aligned. In fact, they're often misaligned. There's just not that D component, as Mr. Louis said, that goes into that factor. Second, when these investments are being made, there's not a level playing field for them. There's an attraction of state capital and other incentives in China, many of which are not supposed to be there because of obligations to the World Trade Organization. And the compound effect of it is this. We know from good research that when production moves, innovation moves as well. And you lose that ecosystem for innovation in the United States, which is a pressing concern for the industries of the future. We also know that in China in particular, it's subject to theft and replication and the building up of national champions, and then it's used against us in another way as well. So our companies that had invested there are being replaced by firms that are national champions that are either state-controlled or state-related. And this goes well beyond what I would call traditional kind of national security applications because there is so much civil military fusion in China, it's almost impossible to disaggregate those. And so this type of investment certainly deserves far more scrutiny than it has. And I hope that a strong provision can be included in the final Bipartisan Innovation Act.
Thanks very much. Mr. Chairman, I'll give back 11 seconds.
We'll take them. All right. Thank you, Senator Casey, very much. Senator Cortez Masto, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to you and Ranking Member Cornyn for holding this hearing. It's clear the best way to source and actually secure a stable supply of resources and goods that not just Nevadans but Americans need is to make investments domestically. We've been talking about that. One of the areas I'm curious your thoughts on, and Mr. Paul, let me start with you, is I believe we have to grow the mining and production of critical minerals, right, and rare earth materials domestically to secure our supply chains, to lower prices, and actually create good paying jobs right here in the United States. That's one of the reasons why I was proud to support the Senate version of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, because it did include dedicated funding for research and development of new technologies for extraction and processing of minerals. I am also planning to introduce the Rare Earth Magnet Manufacturing Production Tax Credit Act, which would create a new credit for the production of rare earth magnets right here in the U.S. to help us grow this critical component of our domestic supply chain and create new jobs. Investing in rare earth mineral production here at home is also a matter of national security. And so, Mr. Paul, can you discuss the importance of investing in growing our domestic production of critical and rare earth minerals for our national security?
Senator, thank you so much for raising up that question. I think it's important, and thank you for your leadership on it. We have seen over the last couple of decades how vulnerable we are because of our lack of domestic capacity with respect to these critical rare earth minerals, with from lithium to names that are hard for anybody to pronounce. But at any rate, the problem is twofold. We don't make enough here, and too much of that we're dependent on a supply from China, which obviously can be weaponized or withdrawn at any time. And an additional concern is that the way in which some of these rare earth minerals are extracted around the world is ethically troubling as well. And so the more control we have over production and supply chain, I think that more aligns with not only our national security interests, but our values as well. It will take investment because we're essentially starting from scratch again, as you pointed out. I remember because I was raised in Indiana, not far from one of the last rare earth magnet manufacturing facilities in the United States, and it's hard to incubate new industry. That requires intent. That requires investments because there's lots of capital barriers, and it probably does require some trade protections as well in order to do that. There needs to be perhaps a transition period, but we need to ensure that the utilizer of these rare earths are going to be comfortable and supportive of building up that domestic supply as well. So I applaud your efforts, and I think that this is an essential thing, not only for our national security, but for the industries we want to build in the future. A lot of these renewable energies and EVs that are going to depend heavily on these rare earth minerals.
Thank you. And I noticed, Dr. Frankel, you're also shaking your head. Anything else to add?
No, I also applaud your effort, and as you know, many of these minerals are also critical for our clean climate initiatives. So if we want to really be able to go green, it's also essential that we develop domestic capabilities.
Thank you. And Dr. Frankel, let me ask you this. How can we use preferential supply arrangements to diversify sourcing away from China and Russia? So
IPEF, for instance, sets out certain standards. It's looking to raise labor, digital, and environmental standards. I would like to see countries, and it gives those countries opportunities to move away from some of the regressive Chinese standards. I would like to see some of those countries get preferential supplier status so their products can be expedited to the U.S., number one. Number two, they should be preferred sourcing destinations for the U.S. You know, when we have countries that meet our standards, we should really provide incentives for U.S. companies to locate in countries that meet our standards.
Mr. Louie, do you have any comments on that as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. As I said earlier in my testimony, we need to have these fast paths to make sure that we have the advantage, not just here in the U.S., but with our allies. I would particularly point out the importance of using next-generation technologies for processing of these rare earth minerals. Right? Many of the rare earths that we actually source in the U.S., we actually ship to China to do the processing. So this is more than just, a theory of, what the Chinese could do. Ask Japan what happens to rare earth supplies if Japan runs afoul to the Chinese will. They could shut them off. That could be us. So this investment that we're talking about is an investment that will have long-term benefits. Those rare earths are critical for many of the disruptive technologies and emerging technologies that the U.S. has to lead. If we lead in the technologies but we don't have access to the raw materials, we cannot maintain our leadership, much less complete our supply chains.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Next, Senator Whitehouse. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your kind words about our work on the infrastructure bill. You were a terrific leader in that, and much appreciated. Rhode Island is facing really significant supply chain problems. Much of it's in the manufacturing sector. And some of the things that have been more resilient have been protected by pretty old school stuff. So Rhode Island used to be the textile center of the universe. And we still have a vibrant textile industry. And the Berry Amendment requires that certain defense materials be made here in the United States, webbing and various textiles like that. And it's really helped us quite well. So I guess my first point is the solutions don't have to be enormously complicated. You can take a Berry Amendment and do a lot of good with it. And it's really quite easy and straightforward. It has also been a launching pad for innovation. We have something called 401 Tech Bridge, which is a innovative and smart textile design and innovation function that we're working with the Office of Naval Research on. They have a lot of very complex textile needs in the future. And that is supported by the Rhode Island Textile Innovation Network, which is supported by the Rhode Island textile community, which is there because of the Berry Amendment. So as we look at exotic ways to improve supply chain, let's not forget the extremely simple ways to protect supply chain, which work. Dr. Frankel, I just wanted to check in with you on the use of the defense. You've been talking in wonderful ways about our climate responsibilities. The use of the Defense Production Act to defend our solar installation industry and to protect battery materials. Has that been a good idea, and should we do more?
I think it is a good idea. I think we need to, however, use it very selectively. You know, I would not at all advise widespread use, but I think for certain critical technology, and I do think those technologies are critical for us, I would support using it. I just wanted to mention, you know, as you know, we have a government procurement agreement code for the United States, and our regulations do specify in general that selling to the U.S. government, companies that sell must have a certain percent of U.S. content in their product. I think it was increased from 50% to 75% by the administration. I just mentioned that in response to your comment about
the Berry Amendment. Yes, exactly. Mr. Paul, should there be an Office of Supply Chain Resiliency, given that this is a perennial problem? And would national security effects and choke point concerns be two of the telltales that the Office of Supply Chain Resiliency should focus on, look out for?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator Whitehouse. Thank you for the question. There should be such an office, and I know that I appreciate your leadership on that, and I know that there's a version of this in the House bill of the Competes Act as well. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Commerce Department does have expertise in this area and is accustomed to supplier scouting. And second, I think it's very difficult, given the private sector in the United States, to provide that kind of transparency outside of like a trusted actor. And so I think that's important for both early warning signaling and also to flag vulnerabilities. And to also look for market opportunities for firms that are looking to enter into such things as well. They may not know that there's an opportunity in a second or third tier for a small and mid-sized manufacturer. So I think the office would be very, very helpful.
I will close out with one observation, which is that an important part of a lot of companies' supply chains is produce, grain, things that are grown, things that are caught. And what we have right now is a very significant hazard to our agricultural production because of climate change, drought, wildfires, flooding. Cargill has made really dark estimates of how the Midwestern grain belt will be less productive and what that will mean. And that has an inflationary effect, obviously, because it doesn't reduce demand when there's less supply. But it also is a supply chain problem. And it, again, I'll close by just observing that it connects to the comments that Dr. Frankel has made about the need for an energy transition. If we want to ignore the energy transition, good luck with your agricultural supply chain and good luck with inflation.
Senator Whitehouse, thank you very much. Let me just say to our witnesses, Senator Whitehouse and I are passionate about climate change. We focus on it every day. Senator Brown and I are passionate about baseball. And our favorite teams are both American League teams. They're both American League Central Division teams. And we have a great time playing. We don't play baseball anymore, but we have a great time talking about it. And among the other things that we're passionate about is the subject of today's hearing. We're delightful that you're here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your flattery of the substance of Senator Whitehouse and the shallowness of my interest. Always an honor to be in this subcommittee, so thank you with my friend Sheldon. So thank you. Mr. Paul, I want to focus my questions on you and to you, if you would. Your testimony covers a lot of what we need to do to undo decades of harm to our economy. We've had these conversations before. They're crystallizing in so many ways with what we've seen happen beginning in the 70s and 80s. I used to walk the halls at Johnny Appleseed Junior High School in Mansfield with the sons and daughters of literally hundreds of steel workers from Empire, Detroit, auto workers from GM, machinists from Ohio Brass, the children of laborers and operating engineers and pipe fitters and plumbers and sheet metal workers. During that period, starting in the 70s and 80s, large corporations lobbied Congress for trade deals and tax policy, always with their eye on cheaper labor. First, they shut down production in Mansfield, Ohio, and around particularly the Midwest to go to Alabama or Mississippi. Labor wasn't cheap enough there. So then it was Mexico passing NAFTA. Then it was PNTR going to China. Ohioans individually in Mansfield, Ohio, and other places paid the price in the form of lost jobs. Communities paid the price in the form of devastation of their public education systems and their neighborhoods. And now the whole country pays the price. Much of the inflation right now is caused or made worse by supply chains that were too spread out, too long, and too fragile. We ask American companies to compete against non-market economies like China that use unfair trade practices. I blame China for sure, but I blame U.S. companies that betrayed this country more so and lobbied this Congress and the politicians that went along. Bank of America said, and this is pretty amazing, that stock prices on Wall Street are more likely to go up when we invest in China's economy than if we invest in America's economy. That's not some progressive from Northern Ohio talking, that's Bank of America talking. You mentioned the importance of trade enforcement tools, urged this body to include Level the Playing Field 2.0 that Senator Portman and I have worked on in the Bipartisan Innovation Act. Expand in your testimony, tell us why trade enforcement is an investment in American workers and American innovation.
Senator, thank you for the question. It's an important one. I know it's important to Ohio and to workers and to businesses around the country. Trade enforcement is important because it prevents leakage, and it provides one of the principal roles of government is also to ensure that private sector firms in the United States have the opportunity for that level playing field when competing abroad. They're the advocate for our private sector firms abroad. And so too often, as you indicated, we have seen that either through trade policy or through other measures that we have lost good jobs, we've lost capacity. This has impacted our national security. It's impacted communities measurably in terms of social and economic decline. And the reason for trade enforcement is that we have to have a rules-based system that we know our private businesses can count on. That also sends a market signal to them that if they invest in the United States, that we will stand up to unfair trade practices that may affect them in our market, in a third market, or with respect to China or other countries. The problem has been that a lot of the importers have figured a way around these laws over the year, and they're very crafty. It's like whack-a-mole at the carnival. If you put one trade enforcement measure up, they'll figure out another way around it through circumvention or slight alteration of the product, as I know you well know. And so the Level the Playing Field Act 2.0 builds on, I know, a bipartisan effort from 2015 that you and Senator Portman and many others were engaged with that would provide our government with new tools to be able to modernize our trade laws to keep up with this whack-a-mole strategy that a lot of the importers who engage in unfair trade practices have. I think it's an essential part of competitive legislation because we can invest all we want in our domestic industries. If we don't have a level playing field for them, those efforts will be for naught, or the impact of them will be dramatically diminished.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Brown, thank you very much. We've been joined by the chairman of the full committee, Senator Wyden, who knows a lot about these issues, whose state these issues are incredibly important. So, Senator Wyden, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper, and I think this is an enormously important hearing, and I so appreciate your taking the lead on the supply chain efforts. Let me start with you, Mr. Paul. Your testimony highlights the critical nexus between strengthening American manufacturing and creating more resilient supply chains. That is just enormously important. It's especially true when it comes to clean energy, and our country needs to put points on the board right now against the climate crisis. That means investing in clean energy tech like solar power and bringing manufacturing back to the country. So we're not swapping dependence on Russian and Saudi oil for dependence on Chinese solar panels. Now, we know the Chinese government is pulling out all the stops to run U.S. solar manufacturers out of business. Now, for years, the Chinese government and its state-owned enterprises have cheated and bullied and stolen from our U.S. solar manufacturers, decimating our domestic industry. Here's my question to you. You may be familiar with the bill that we wrote here in this room and the room next door, the Clean Energy for America bill. This is a bill where we essentially took the 45 provisions in the federal tax code and we threw them in the trash can. And we said for the future, we would have a technology neutral, private market, and we would say for the first time, the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. And for 100 years, and by the way, Chairman Carper was enormously important to this. Basically, everywhere he's gone for over a year, he said this can be the future, technology neutral, private market, and using incentives to drive down carbon emissions. We also have a special focus in the bill on solar manufacturing. And I especially want to credit our colleagues from Georgia who are really talking about a different energy future. Senator Warnock, Senator Ossoff, they'd like to have a different energy future because the South, for reasons of lacking transmission capacity and others, hasn't been able to tap the future. So we are very serious about promoting solar manufacturing in this committee in the United States, in Georgia and Oregon and all over the country. So tell us what other steps besides Clean Energy for America, which, by the way, will hit more than 50% of the president's carbon emission reductions, target just in its fell swoop. And when you add Senator Carper's methane reductions, we're more in the ballpark of 70% of the president's target. So this is a high-stakes area. What else would you do in terms of promoting solar manufacturing? Manufacturing, not just buying panels from overseas here in the United States.
Senator Wyden, thank you for the question. Thank you for your leadership on this. I know that you have solar manufacturing in Oregon, and I want to state the fundamental problem so that folks are aware of this is that we have seen solar installations escalate dramatically over the last decade. We've seen solar manufacturing jobs in the United States decline slightly over that same period, and so the market share is dominated by China or pass-through countries where these Chinese solar panels are coming into the United States. I think that the fundamental principle, and I think you get this right, is that the incentives for both installation and production must be aligned. And so there must be tax credits for production in the United States, along with the incentives to install for utilities or residential or commercial. So I think that's very important. I think the second important aspect of this is obviously the trade enforcement. And so I do think that we have to take steps to ensure that Chinese solar panels are not being circumvented and entering the United States improperly that way. And I think the third is this utilization of the Defense Production Act, which I think is important, that could also spur procurement. And from a procurement perspective, and I know Senator Whitehouse mentioned this, the Berry Amendment as well, I think because of Buy America, Buy American requirements, that the government can set an example by purchasing these made-in-America solar panels throughout the federal government. And that is a sizable public market. And also that ensure that grants or loans made to states or sub-federal entities have that linkage as well. I think those are some concrete steps that could build up solar manufacturing.
My time has expired, and I don't want my comments directed to Mr. Paul to in any way suggest that our other three panelists aren't making important contributions. You're doing it. Continue to do it. This issue that Senator Carper is taking the lead on for the full committee is absolutely crucial. So I'm going to review, like he will, your comments, and I thank all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Wyden chairs the full committee, and there's many more times than Senator Thune and I can recall when we've used all of our time, and he has generously extended additional time to us. So I would never cut you off, my friend. So thank you. Thanks for your kind words and for your leadership of this committee. Senator Thune, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having the hearing. The supply chain challenge is a very real issue, and thank you all for being here to talk about it. In early February, Senator Klobuchar and I introduced the Open Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which passed the Senate in March, passed the House on Monday, and is headed to the President's desk this week. It's a bipartisan bill that provides the Federal Maritime Commission with new tools to curb unreasonable or anti-competitive behavior, which we believe will improve fluidity at our nation's ports and across the entire supply chain. Beyond reforms at the Commission, our nation's ports are desperately in need of two things: modernization and transparency. Failure to invest in terminal automation and port efficiency initiatives such as data sharing compounds the problems that we are facing today and puts the United States below the global average in vessel wait times, which is why my legislation also includes provisions to improve the movement of freight across the supply chain. Mr. Potvin, do you believe that increased data sharing and better utilization of technology would help to mitigate inefficiencies at our nation's ports?
I believe data analytics and data generations would be very helpful across the board, especially to know when dwell times, when you got ships there, are taking longer to unload. You notice from the report we're looking at close to 7 days when it used to be 5 day dwell time turnaround on a ship. And time's going on that pace. Sharing data across the ports would allow for the movement of vessels in the different ports to utilization of capacity, for the dray carriers to make sure they're ready and set to move the products quicker from the ports into the consumers into the United States. process. So the sharing of data analytics, sharing of visibility, of transparency of where your cargo is would be very helpful. Get the goods moving sooner and quicker in the process.
Thank you. Mr. Paul, outside of ports, where are you seeing the most significant strain on manufacturing supply chains?
Senator Thune, thank you for asking the question. A lot of this is related to inventory misalignment, and we've seen that in particular with respect to semiconductors. And the challenge essentially is that our domestic capacity on semiconductors is quite limited. Our domestic consumption of semiconductors is quite high. Asian customers, where many of these semiconductors are produced, obviously we're first in line for this, and also, it's an ocean away. And so I think efforts to invest in additional domestic capacity in critical commodities like that, that are involved in so many aspects of our daily life, is going to be essential. So I'm hopeful that the Bipartisan Innovation Act can include some provisions that would be of value there, because I think the more control we have over our supply chains, I think the better off we're going to be in terms of that type of inventory management, because we've seen it from cars to semiconductors to smart appliances. It is a real vulnerability, and so taking steps to identify where we can and should be producing more in the United States is something that I think is valuable use of the Senate's time.
Yeah. The baby formula shortage has shown a need to look at supply chain failures and how to prevent this kind of a public health crisis from happening again. Obviously, there are a number of factors at play, but one of the largest is the FDA's inability to anticipate the shortage and to ensure sufficient production was up and running, which is sort of incomprehensible to determine how we got to this point in the first place. But it's been a major crisis, I think, as everybody knows, for for American families. And I think the administration has been far too slow to respond. The administration finally encouraged overseas manufacturers to ship formula to the United States, easing regulations that had effectively prevented shipments from many of those companies. Now, there's a lot of talk about reshoring and supply chain resiliency. This crisis has shown that the critical importance of having strong economic relationships with other countries is just absolutely critical. So let's ask Mr. Potvin how important it is for America's supply chain to maintain and strengthen the free flow of goods and services with trusted nations. And are there particular tariffs or regulatory barriers that Congress should consider to better streamline baby formula imports, or more generally, just better protect food security?
Senator, thank you for the question. I'm not a real expert on the subject matter that you're talking about on that nature, but I do know the free flow of goods is a requirement that, nearshoring, bringing back to the United States. One thing I do know, we got to take in consideration one of the most essential workers in this place is the American truck driver. The American truck driver needs to be protected and make sure there's enough of them. So we appreciate the infrastructure, the 3-year pilot program for the 18 to 20 years able to go across interstate lines or interstate lines as opposed to intrastate. We also believe that there needs to be some type of safety mechanism to take the bad actor off the road so we can drop the insurance cost that the motor carriers are paying to help them to also continue to operate in this type of economy with fuel prices going up. Again, this American truck driver, we can do all this, bring everything back, but it's a fact of the matter is we need trucks on the road and drivers in those seats to make sure the goods get moved. You may be able to bring them to the port. You may bring them into manufacturing, wherever you may be. Without that American truck driver and the third-party logistics industry being able to move those goods across country, it's not going to matter. And we need to take a look at, seriously, looking at fuel prices, looking at insurance, looking at driver wages, making sure that we are competitive in nature, that we can supply the goods that the consumer needs. So I apologize I can't answer the question you have, Senator, but I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, the chairman's probably trying to wrap here, but Dr. Frankel, this has to do with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's non-binding and it may have potential, but it just seems that enforceable market access commitments in particular would help lower costs for consumers and increase pay for workers, and build more reliable supply chains. So could you just talk a little for a moment about how enforceable market access commitments benefit supply chain resilience for producers and consumers?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think, the administration was hesitant, did not want to launch a market access agreement in the classical sense, because I think there was a lot of concern about the reaction and the lack of support in the public and in certain sectors of Congress about that. So I think what they've launched is a positive first step forward. I do hope in the fullness of time that this could evolve into a market access agreement. And I do think that offering market access to countries, we're looking to them to make very significant concessions in certain areas. And it's important that we be able to offer incentives for them to do that. It's also equally important that we be able to get better access into their markets. So I think what the administration is doing with IPEF is important. And as I said, I do hope over the fullness of time that it can evolve into a more traditional market access agreement.
I would just offer, Mr. Chairman, in wrapping up, that if the United States does not have a meaningful market access presence in the Indo-Pacific, I think that China very definitely can threaten our supply chain priorities in that area. I think that's a concern that, as we think about that region, and particularly what I think is a very weak agreement, we need to be, there a lot more needs to be done in terms of tangible solutions that actually do offer market access for our exporters and hopefully give them an incentive to join us in some of these deals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Thune, thank you so much for joining us, and I would have extended even more time if you'd sought it. So thanks for coming. I think Mr. Piper talked a little bit about truck drivers, and I couldn't agree with you more. I'd also note Delaware actually happens to be the state where I think there are more Amtrak employees who live in Delaware than any state in the country. So trains for us are important too. I was once reminded of this statistic. You can move a ton of freight by rail from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Massachusetts with 1 gallon of fuel. It's pretty impressive, 1 gallon of fuel. Okay, we have about 24 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up about breakfast time. It won't last that long, but are you guys okay for maybe a couple more questions? All right, thanks. You're doing a great job, by the way, so thank you. I think my first question will be for Mr. Potvin, if I could. In your testimony, you noted over the last couple of years that supply chains, and I think this is a quote, bent but never broke. And that is thanks to the resilience and flexibility of companies like Trinity Logistics in the face of systemic supply chain weaknesses both here and across the globe. I frequently say that we need to find out what works, do more of that. I always say that. I say it probably once or twice a day. Find out what works, do more of that. And over the last couple of years, how has the private sector innovated in response to the supply chain crisis, and how can policymakers like us in this body work with logistics operators and other private sector stakeholders to strengthen our supply chains moving forward? Mr. Potvin.
Senator Carper, I appreciate the question. We've seen over 2 years a lot of movement in the manufacturing, domestic manufacturing side. We saw companies such as Costco, Home Depot, Walmart, IKEA actually charter or buy their own ships to make sure they could get their goods moved where they needed to. We've seen manufacturers change packaging so better ways to transport their goods at a lower cost for them. Innovation and more greater visibility in the supply chain through technology so that people could see where their goods were moving, or tracking on these trucks so that they could see every 15 minutes where that carrier was, where they needed to do. If the carrier got stopped, immediately to think about shipping another order out to make the needs met. Better technology through the matching of our capacity, carrier capacity, with the shippers in the various locations. So again, better visibility so we could move that motor carrier, suggest that motor carrier to go get that load. Could you close? Less deadhead miles for you, less fuel being consumed as well. We saw a lot of manufacturers move from a business-to-business model to a business-to-consumer model, changing their technology, getting more into the e-commerce to meet the needs of the individual shipper or the individual consumer who is staying home, not being able to make it out to the store. They altering their manufacturing production locations to be closer to the raw materials they could get their hands on to make sure, again, they're supplying it. They took a lot of risk, but they wanted to make sure their consumers, their customers, met that way. We've seen a lot of innovation around data analytics and data generations, transparency, and efficiencies that led to increased productivity and additional savings in that nature. If we were to take the technology and share data, as Senator Thune was indicating, among the ports, among the shipping lines, so that goods could be rerouted, moved where congestion was happening, or ports get to shut down, or something, natural disaster. Real-time visibility, real-time communication to move and react in a situation, to share data across the board in a safe and secure way. We talked about the innovation of the smaller fleets and the owner-operators, the simple fact that they were the first ones to return when production started to pick up. They were hungry for money, hungry for loads, right? And the simple fact of the matter, they moved quickly to make sure that the goods kept moving. We need to make sure that the goods continue to flow across interstate lines, and certainly we just want to look at the way of making sure that the government promotes interstate and not get hung up in the intrastate government sometimes, and make sure the goods flow across this country and not get struck in state laws.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for all of that. I want to ask Mr. Paul another question, if I could. And it's a question dealing with government coordination of supply chains. And one challenge in addressing supply chain issues is that the U.S. government does not effectively track supply chain vulnerabilities before they become full-blown crisis. A provision under consideration in the so-called China competition bill, led by our friend Delaware Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, would authorize a new office in the Department of Commerce to monitor and also to respond to supply chain gaps. My question would be for you, Mr. Paul, how can greater government oversight and attention to supply chain challenges improve economic resilience and support domestic manufacturing in critical industries?
Senator Carper, thank you for the question. I've had the opportunity to be able to understand what some of the vulnerabilities are is going to be critically important. And I would add, in my experience in working with the Manufacturing Extension Partnership as part of the Department of Commerce, and I know that there are many state affiliates of this, including one that serves Delaware, that supplier scouting and the ability to identify manufacturers is important. And so it's important not only to understand what the vulnerabilities are, but also what the opportunities are. If there are supply chain weaknesses or large OEMs who say, I can't find a third-tier supplier, I can't find a second-tier supplier, this type of supplier scouting can be valuable in seeking out new market opportunities for small and mid-sized firms who don't have massive marketing or sales staffs that can seek this out. And so I think that can be helpful as well. And so I am hopeful that as part of this innovation package, that this becomes a piece of it, because this is one of the most helpful things for the small and mid-sized firms in particular to be part of opportunities in the future and to create and to help contribute to supply chain resiliency.
All right. Well, I'm hopeful too, and I'm going to pass along your kind words to our Congresswoman. A third question, Dr. Frankel, if I might, on medical product supply chains. COVID-19, as we know, has laid bare serious concerns about our medical product supply chains and the need to work with partners around the world as we attempt to put this pandemic behind us and to ensure that we're better prepared for the next one that we know is coming somewhere down the line. Senator Cornyn and I sent a letter to the President, I think it was about a year ago, in which we urged the administration to reduce trade barriers in order to help shore up these supply chains. My question, Dr. Frankel, will be what measures would you recommend that Congress and the administration consider to strengthen medical product supply chains?
Thank you. I think, and I have to say I'm not an expert on medical supply issues, but I think just in general, things that we can do, as you mentioned, reduce barriers. Number two, obviously decide which products we want to either onshore or nearshore. You know, I know that many of those products are now coming from China and elsewhere, where they're, again, more subject to the shutdowns in Shanghai and political issues and things like that. I think we need to offer, for things that are really critical, we need to offer incentives to manufacture here. I read, for instance, that I know at the height of the pandemic, the U.S. offered incentives for company, all our PPE tends to be imported, and we offered incentives to manufacture masks in the United States, and a number of companies invested based on that and started producing masks. But then, after those incentives went away, hospitals started buying cheaper masks from China again. So a number of those facilities actually had to close down, even though they'd made significant investments. So I think we need to think long-term. You know, we can't just be thinking short-term, like give an incentive, but then you need to sustain it if you want to have that capacity the next time that a pandemic rolls around. I think also in terms of nearshoring, again, some of the textile companies in, I know, Central America are interested in potentially producing PPE. But again, they need support to do that. So I think we need to look critically at the supply chain, decide what things are really important to manufacture in the U.S., manufacture close by, and for those things that we're still importing, we need to reduce trade barriers and facilitate trade.
Good. For somebody who didn't know much about medical product supply chains, that was pretty good. I have another one. It was so good, in fact, I'm going to ask you one more question if I could. All right. And this one deals with environmental standards and supply chains. And I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and serve with a couple of people who have been here with us today, including Senator Whitehouse. But we have a heightened interest on our committee in the intersection of trade and the environment, as you might imagine. Dr. Frankel, in your testimony, I believe you noted that rethinking our supply chains can encourage green sourcing or procuring goods and services in a more sustainable way. I'm heartened by the recent agreement between the U.S. and the EU to decarbonize steel and aluminum production. And my question would be this: moving forward, what other opportunities exist to make our global supply chains more environmentally sustainable?
Well, one thing that I would strongly support is the reopening of the environmental goods negotiations. During my time at GE, I spent a lot of time, the company had many green products from wind, solar, other batteries, and I was very involved in those negotiations, which actually got quite far, but they stopped, came to an abrupt stop in 2016 when the administration didn't support trade or environmental issues. But I think it's time to really reopen that. I would advise expanding it to, beyond environmental goods to include environmental services, which I think are very important. I would, one of the main blocks to completing the negotiation during the first time around was the inclusion of China. I think it probably makes sense this time around not to include China. And, that would probably necessitate it not being a WTO agreement, which I think would really facilitate completing it. And I think we should do a plurilateral agreement with as many countries as possible to lower tariffs on as many
Did you say
goods.
plurilateral?
Correct.
I've been in the Senate a long time. I don't think I've ever heard a witness use that word.
Okay, sorry.
It's a first for everything.
Sorry about the jargon. Plurilateral, multilateral, is like, everybody. Plurilateral is maybe a more, like IPEF is a plurilateral agreement. So I think we need to do an agreement with as many countries as we can get on board for environmental goods and services to really promote and facilitate cheaper and easier trade in those products and services.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question I'm going to ask for each of you. The first, when I did that at the beginning of the question, I asked you, where did you find that there's consensus amongst the four of you? And the last question that I'm going to ask is, what would be a question that you wish you had been asked, but you weren't asked? What would be a question that you wish that somebody had asked you, but you didn't get asked? So think about that. And while you're thinking about that, Mr. Lloyd, so I like saying your name. Mr. Lloyd knows there's one of my favorite songs as a kid growing up it had his name in it 2 times, Lloyd. And so we're grateful for that great memory. And also for your responses today. And here's one more opportunity for you to respond, and that would be dealing with cybersecurity and the supply chain. Something you know a little bit about, I'm told. As a senior member, actually as a former chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, I know the nexus between trade and national security is a policy area that requires our attention. Over the past several years, we've seen a rise in state-sponsored cyber attacks, including those on our supply chains. My question is this, Mr. Lloyd: what steps should the federal government take proactively to reduce cybersecurity vulnerabilities in supply chains? And how can information sharing between the private sector and the federal government help identify additional weaknesses in our critical supply chains?
That's a great question. One of the critical tools we have is that we have some great agencies that do a great job in protecting the U.S. government. CISA is a great organization. We need to think about that umbrella of protection to extend to our commercial companies and our critical infrastructure beyond those that are government-related. And when we think about supply chains, particularly helping companies understand their third-party risks that could be exposed because the third-party suppliers do not have the tools necessary, particularly smaller companies, to do the kinds of cyber protection necessary to protect that chain, puts at great risk not just our smaller companies, but some of our most important systems. So that umbrella of protection needs to be broader. We need to have better information sharing. I think the Slurring report had some terrific recommendations, but we got to move beyond the recommendations and into implementation. We need a public-private solution that has companies being willing to help their smaller companies and industry partners to make sure that they are secure. The Chinese and the Russians have particularly attacked the supply chain, because I do not need to attack the U.S. government if I can attack the companies that the government depends on. And we need to, again, extend that umbrella of protection.
All right. Every 2 years around here, we have the opportunity to change leadership of subcommittees and committees depending on who's the majority and who's not, who stays, who retires and leaves and goes on to do other things. And when about, 7, 8, 9 years ago, it was announced that I was going to be in a new Congress about to start, I was going to be the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee on governmental affairs. There's a wonderful article in, I think, the Wall Street Journal that talked about the changes in leadership in the different committees. And it mentioned the Homeland Security Committee, and it said I was going to be the chair for the next 2 years at least of Homeland Security. And the article went on to say that I was the Senate's expert on cybersecurity. I cut the article out and I brought it home and I showed it to my wife. I said, honey, look at this. This says I am the Senate's expert on cybersecurity now. I'll never forget what she said. She said, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So We all need somebody to keep us in our place, I suppose. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on the supply chain, but we're, thanks to all of you, are a good deal smarter than we might have been a couple of hours ago, and we'll hopefully continue to build on that going forward. Now, the question that I wanted each of you to give me, we'll start with you, Mr. Lewis, if you don't mind. What is a question, maybe you can think of a question that you'd like to have been asked but were not asked?
I think the question I would have loved to be asked is, how does a reimagined U.S. advanced manufacturing infrastructure change the way we think about supply chains?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Dr. Frankel, is there a question that you might like to have been asked?
Sure. Two quick things.
Okay.
One is, we talked a lot about investing in manufacturing and R&D. I think we really need to invest in our people. And I wish that we had been asked about that. Secondly, I think we really need to invest in and reform in the WTO. We shouldn't forget that. And I wish I'd been asked about that. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Mr. Potvin.
Well, I was hoping I'd be asked, are you glad to be here today? And the answer would be yes. First time
great.
here, and it's an absolute humbling experience and a pleasure to be here.
Isn't it cool? We get to do this kind of stuff. A couple guys from Delaware.
It is. It is. Honestly, I think for me, and again, my colleagues here, much more learned in the space in which the wider scope of supply chain. I think for me is the question simply asked, how do we ensure that the goods, wherever they come from, wherever they're manufactured, can be delivered best way with the efficient operations? How do we pull those resources together to make sure that happens?
Great.
That would have been the question.
Thank you so much. Mr. Paul?
Senator, thank you. I think the question that I would have liked to have been asked is there hope? Because my testimony laid out a number of dire, I think, data points that can be and should be very concerning. And I'll answer it briefly, if you don't mind, with your indulgence.
No.
I do think there is hope, and I'll just give an example. I remember seeing you just a couple of months ago at the Department of Transportation as they unveiled the electric vehicle charging network grants through the infrastructure bill, which I know you led on. And I think that is the perfect example of how public policy can drive investment in the United States and secure important supply chains, and is just having that intent. So yes, I do think that there is hope.
Oh, that's great. There's a reason, there's some method to my madness. One of the things that we do is we'll follow up after this hearing, and we'll send you questions for the record, as you may or may not know. And we'll, somewhere in my notes it says, let me just get this straight. There was questions, let's see, for senators who wish to submit questions. For the record, those questions are due 7 days from today. We'll assemble these questions. Our witnesses will have, it says 45 days, that's a long time, to respond to any questions for the record. And we're going to use those questions, among others, to follow up with you. So you will have a chance to respond to those questions. I think most people who don't have the opportunity to sit in a room like this or watch a hearing on television or over the internet, they think all we do here is fight among ourselves. We don't work together. We never want to really get any things done and take on difficult and challenging issues. And I hope today would be an anecdote to those perceptions. We like each other for the most part, and we like working together, and that includes across party lines. The stakes are pretty high on the issues that we're discussing here today. Lincoln used to say the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. Another one of my favorite witnesses was a fellow who said, not long ago, he was from Wyoming, good friend of Senator John Barrasso, and he'd been nominated for a post in the last administration in the Department of Interior. And he said these words, he said that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. He said bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And that's what we work toward. Don't always succeed, but that's what we work for. But you've given us a lot to work with. And for that, we are deeply grateful. We have a member of our team who's sitting right behind me, and her name is Naomi Ziegler. She won't be sitting back there next week, and she's accepted a position to go to work for, I want to say, OMB, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, OMB. And she won't have my back like she has for the last several years. But we're going to miss her, and we wish her Godspeed as she leads from this place. Thank you all. It's great to be with all of you. And for some of you, especially those of you whose first name is Sarah, I look forward to seeing you back in Delaware. And for one of you, can bring your husband with you, and the other, your colleague. And with that, it's a wrap. We're concluded. Thank you.